I couldn't hear you. Okay, good. We need some energy in the room. So how many of you have relatives in the building trades unions already? Okay, maybe a third of you. How about came from union families? Probably maybe a quarter of you. Have been in a union before? Maybe 15% of you. How about work non-union in construction? Okay, there we go. We got a lot of non-union folks originally. We're organized into the union. A few of you. And worked for low wages before you joined the union. Okay, now we get our hands up here. Okay, so it's a better deal coming in here, but there's no guarantee that the good deal is going to stay unless you help make the union stronger and build it. There's no guarantee that 30 years from now you'll have as good a deal or better deal than you got now. You with me on that? Yeah. I can't hear you. Yeah. Okay, so now I want to tell you a story, but I want to lay a foundation for it. George Santayana once said, "Those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Those who do not remember their past are condemned to repeat their mistakes." Our history as working class people and as unionists are the game films of history, okay? And what do we do with game films? We study what we did right, we study what we did wrong, we make adjustments. That didn't work, better do something different. That worked, keep doing it. And we study what our opponents did that worked and didn't work, and we make adjustments at halftime, we make adjustments after the game. And I would argue that if we do not do that as a labor movement, we're doomed. If you do it in pro sports, we have to do it in our own movement. So the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "The labor movement was the principal force that transformed misery and despair into hope and progress. The captains of industry did not lead this transformation." He's saying that people like you and like me created a better America. It was not the billionaires who did it. We're the heroes and heroines of this story at our best. It doesn't mean we haven't made mistakes, but I'm going to demonstrate to you that in fact we are the heroes and heroines of this story. Need to learn from those successes and failures. It was not the billionaires who led this. So I want to show you a graph here for a second to sort of say, where are we in American history? What did I do? Not sure what I did. Okay, there we go. Don't depend on me for tech support. So over here on the left is the percentage of workers in the United States that are unionized. So let's go to about 1905. It's about 12% union. And the country basically remains about 12-13% union. 1 out of 8 workers, except during World War I. Corporate America counterattacks and smashes our movement. So over 3 decades, we make no progress in building our movement. This is a period where we're under relentless attack and we're relatively weak. This is the great uprising of the people and working people in the 1930s. We triple in size in 10 years. We begin to decline. By 1980, we're down at 25%, but we're still very strong compared to this earlier period of history. This is when Ronald Reagan is elected. I lose my job at a union bust right here. We lose 30% of our members by 1983, and by 2017, we're down at 10.5%, which is the lowest it's been since the late 1920s. The red line is the private sector unions. That's non-government. That's you. We're down at 6.5%. It's the lowest it's been since 1900. So our movement today, right now, is weaker than it's been in over 100 years. And it is critical that we turn this around. Obviously, the organizing that's being done in 528 and in the building trades and all across the country is critical, but we need more people involved in the efforts to rebuild our movement, because if our movement keeps getting smaller, corporate America will go for the kill. Am I making sense to you? I couldn't hear you. Okay, so now let me tell you this story. I'd like to introduce you to my grandfather, James, his wife, Jane, grandfather, Adelbert, grandmother, can't even remember her name at the moment. Mabel, there you go. James went to work at age 10, got pulled out of 3rd grade, went to work in a brickyard and worked for 65 years. Adelbert was well educated. In comparison, he graduated from 5th grade, went to work in a factory when he was 12, and worked until his untimely death in his mid-50s. Why did they go to work at age 10 and 12? Because in a non-union America, wages were so low that working class families couldn't make enough money to put a roof over their head, feed the family, and heat the house without the labor of their children. And so millions of their kids, including my grandparents, were denied the opportunities to get educations if they wanted it and to reach for their dreams because of the dominant power of corporate America and their refusal to share the wealth that we were creating. This is one of my favorite quotes. The most beautiful sight that we see is the child at labor. As early as he may get at labor, the more beautiful, the more useful does his life get to be. No kidding. We got a 9-year-old white girl, barefooted, working in the textile mills. She looks like she's having a hell of a good time. We got 10 or 11-year-old black boys picking cotton out in the fields. What does the future look like for these kids? Not very good. Not very good. And I can assure you that Mr. Candler, who was one of the millionaires and billionaires of the day, he made sure that his kids had an opportunity to get an education so they could choose what they wanted to do. He didn't send them to work in a textile mill. He didn't send them to work picking cotton in the fields when they were 10 or 11. They were being trained to rule over my ancestors and probably your ancestors too. It was a brutal system and extremely unjust. And people hated this system, which included basically no rights for workers, but also brutal child labor. This is a strike in 1903. 100,000 workers walk out in the Philadelphia textile mills. They're striking for a 55-hour work week. They're currently working 60. They're making between 20 and 25 cents an hour. There's no benefits, there's no unemployment insurance, there's no workers' compensation, there's no health and safety laws. And obviously thousands of them are children, but their wages are desperately needed by their families. They strike, they march to the summer home of President Teddy Roosevelt asking him to intervene in the strike. He tells them to shut up and go home and go back to work. They're starved into submission, the strike is broken, and the 60-hour work week continues. And this kind of beatdown is all too familiar if you look at the history of our ancestors and our movement in the early part of the 20th century. Let's go to the south side of Chicago, where a lot of my people are from. Philip Armour, they call him the king of the packers. This is the biggest concentration of meatpacking plants in the world. Quote, "We pursue policies to keep the races and nationalities apart, stir up suspicion, rivalry, and hatred among them." He is a strategic corporate bigot and racist who understands very clearly if he can keep his workers fighting amongst themselves, they can't unite to build a powerful union and create better conditions and cut into his profits and raise their wages. So what happens in Chicago? There are 5 strikes by tens of thousands of packers in 29 years. They lose all 5 strikes. The industry remains non-union. And what's going on? The Irish are fighting with the Germans, and the Germans are fighting with the Italians, and the Italians with the Poles, and the Poles with the Jews, and the white folk get together and blame it on black folk. And if there are any Latinos around, they'll blame it on them. And I would argue they were morally wrong. They were also politically and economically making an extraordinarily stupid set of mistakes. They played right into the hands of the bosses. But this was what it was like when a very deeply divided working class in our country and our movement remains weak. The country is deeply divided by racism and hatred of other people, quote unquote other. The Ku Klux Klan by 1925 has 4 to 5 million members. It's larger than the labor movement. In today's America, it would be 12 to 15 million. And who are they? They are a domestic terrorist organization who hates blacks, Jews, Catholics, immigrants, Latinos, Asian Pacific Islanders, Native Americans, women who got the right to vote, and they're repeatedly used as strikebreakers. This is a picture of 60,000 members of the Klan marching down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. This is the U.S. Capitol in the background. They're flexing their political muscle, and they're warning the American people, if you dare to stand up to us, we know who you are, we know where you live, and we will come get you. So we have a deeply divided working class, a weak labor movement. Corporate America has the whip hand, and it is hard times for the American people, and particularly working people. Let's go to Detroit, where the other side of my family is from. This is my grandfather at Delbert, working in the auto plant. Now, in 1925, he's got a union job with the railroad, making about 50 cents an hour, which was pretty good money. And down the road is Ford's. And Ford's is paying $5 a day for an 8-hour shift, which was 62 cents an hour, which was a 25% premium, non-union over union. And Grandma and Grandpa discussed this, and finally Grandpa quit the union and went to work at Ford's. And Ford promised lifetime jobs. So good money and a lifetime job. Sweet deal. The American dream came true for my family. They bought a little house on the west side. They bought a Model T car. They got an icebox. They got a radio. They got rugs. And they put curtains up in the windows. And that was the American dream for my family in the 1920s. And they're, quote unquote, living large by working class standards. Who needs a union? So everything is fine and dandy until one day the Depression comes. And Mr. Ford, who promised never to lay anybody off, lays off 91 out of 128,000 workers, including Grandpa. 70% of his workforce. Chrysler and GM do the same thing. Nobody's working in the building trades. Massive unemployment. And Mr. Ford says the average man won't really do a day's work unless he's caught and can't get out of it. There is plenty of work to do if people would do it. Yeah, no kidding. You laid off 70% of your workforce and everybody's gonna go get a job tomorrow, right? So Grandpa's out looking for work and he gets hit by a streetcar. He suffers severe internal injuries. They take him to the hospital. And guess what? He has no money, he has no health insurance, and they don't have the time of day for him. There's no law that says they had to treat him. So they bandage him up and they send him home. They basically sent him home with a death sentence. And the question is, how long would it be before he died? And we have no idea if he would have lived if he'd been Henry Ford and gotten the best health care in Michigan. So our family is in crisis, and we are surviving on $22.50 a month, which is the welfare check from the city of Detroit for 5 people. It's $4.50 a month. It's 15 cents a day. No food stamps, no Medicaid, none of that sort of thing. We're on the edge. And unfortunately, we are not alone. Millions of people are in these bread and soup lines, and the one thing they all have in common is they're all hungry, they're all scared, and to some degree, they're angry. And they may not like the people standing next to them, but they start talking to each other and going, what's going on in the Polish neighborhood? What's going on in the Italian neighborhood? What's going on in the black neighborhood? They say, well, we're going home and telling our kids we don't have enough to eat. Well, boy, we got a lot more in common than we got disagreement here, if we can figure out a way to begin to stick together. So solidarity starts getting built between white and black workers in Detroit in the early 30s. Now, I'm not talking about Latinos and Asian Pacific Islanders and Native Americans, because at that time in Detroit, it's virtually all black and white, very few of those other groups. In other parts of the country, the story looks different. So I'm not leaving people out of disrespect. So they start understanding, we gotta stick together, we gotta start demanding change, because we all face the same nightmare when we go home of what's gonna happen to us and to our families. March 7th, 1932 is a fateful day in American history. It's bitterly cold, wind chill, it's probably 0 degrees. There's a huge protest march through my grandparents' neighborhood. Black and white, shoulder to shoulder, unarmed, nonviolent, exercising our constitutional rights. We were marching to the main plant gate of Ford's, which is right over here. 45,000 people used to work at Ford's, 10,000 are working today. And these are the demands. We want our jobs back. You guaranteed us lifetime work, an end to foreclosures, an end to evictions, free health care. We need coal. We are cold. We need to heat our homes. We want to end the discrimination against blacks in jobs, in housing, and welfare. We want to end to having to bribe company officials to get jobs. And last but not least, we want the right to form a union, which they did not have under federal law. So thousands of us are assembled. The speakers are getting ready to speak, and out of nowhere comes withering gunfire out of the plant. In 5 minutes, 5 are dead, 75 are wounded, and they open up on them with water cannon. So they're soaked to the bone in 0 degree wind chill with withering gunfire. They're picking their dead and wounded up and dragging them and carrying them as fast as they can to get behind cars or trucks or get around the corner behind buildings. This is called the Ford Hunger March Massacre, or the Dearborn Massacre. And I would ask, how many of you know this story? Raise your hand. We got about 8 people out of probably 90. How many of you took American history in high school? Raise your hands. Okay, just about everybody took history in high school. Well, they left it out, right? Why'd they leave it out? Because they don't want us to know what our people went through to try and build this dream and the injustices that came down upon us. It's a very different story. It's a story looking up rather than looking down as to describe what our history looks like. 4 days later, 100,000 people came to the funeral because they understood that the massacre in Dearborn, which is right across the street from Detroit, was an attack on every worker in Michigan. Union, non-union, young, old, tall, skinny, short, fat, native-born, foreign-born, white, person of color, whatever. They will kill us if we stand up and demand just treatment, fairness, and equality in America, and exercising our constitutional rights while we're doing it. Let's fast forward to 1937, 5 years later, Flint, Michigan. The tide has turned. Workers and unions have figured out that instead of going out on strike and being replaced by desperate, hungry strikebreakers, we're going to sit down, we're going to barricade ourselves in the factories, and we're not going to come out until we get a union contract. It's January again. It's bitterly cold. And the Auto Workers Union in Flint, there's 9 General Motors plants there. They managed to seize 5 of those plants, barricade themselves in, and it completely crippled General Motors. They're not producing one car or truck anywhere in the United States. General Motors calls on the governor to bring in the National Guard and shoot them out of the plants. The governor says no. Goes to President Roosevelt and asks for the U.S. Army, says shoot them out of the plants. And Roosevelt says, talk to the governor. This is an example where politics matter. Frank Murphy's just been elected governor. He's Irish American. I'm proud of it that I'm Irish American. Doesn't make me better than anybody else. Doesn't make me worse than anybody else, but it's my heritage. Murphy's been elected with overwhelming support of working people, and he says, we're bringing in the National Guard, but the National Guard is to maintain order. And as long as no one is violent, no one's going to get shot. So we're going to be the peacekeepers rather than side with the corporate boys. So this siege begins. Day after day, thousands of workers are barricaded into these plants. They're trying to starve them out by cutting off the supply of food. So the strikers are asking people to come out and picket by the tens of thousands, which they do, and get food donations loaded on trucks and then surround the trucks with human shields and march till they get to the gates of the plants, open up the gates, unload the food, close the gates, climb on the truck and go back, and it's a human conveyor belt. It goes on for 44 days. Okay? And these are the sisters, the mothers, the girlfriends, the lovers, the grandmothers, the daughters, the granddaughters, the nieces, the aunts, the girlfriends, the neighbors, who are out by the thousands, because this is a fight not just of the union members in the plants, but this is the fight of the entire family and the entire community. Now, these are what are called axe handles. They're a multiple purpose tool. Can be used for a variety of activities, but they basically said, you will not kill our men. You'll have to come through us to kill them. I'm not an advocate of violence, but I'm saying that the people rose up in Flint like never before and begin to change the course of American history. How many of you heard this story? Yeah, 2 people. Okay. They stole your history from you, brothers and sisters. You don't know where you came from. You don't know what our people went through. You don't know what was necessary to get this union contract that you walked in to get today. We are standing on the shoulders of previous generations. And 44 days later, General Motors surrendered, and the Auto Workers Union takes down the biggest corporation in the history of planet Earth, and the American people rise up and change the course of history. Let's hear it for our sisters and brothers in Michigan. If they can do this, so can we. So what did we win? We won the right to organize. We win all these fights, not by ourselves, but with community allies. We win the right to form unions in the private sector. We get Social Security, public assistance for poor families, unemployment insurance, minimum wage, 8-hour day, 5-day week, overtime pay, child labor protections in non-agricultural industries. They crack down on the banksters on Wall Street. But farm workers and domestic workers are left out because of racism, because the number one occupation of black men and Latino men in the 1930s was farm worker, and the number one occupation of black women was domestic workers. They're left out of the deal, including the right to form a union. So we win these huge victories, but the victories are incomplete. And to this day, farm workers and domestic workers still do not have the right to form a union in the United States. But we made a huge breakthrough. And as W.B. Du Bois once said, who was one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, he said, probably the greatest and most effective effort toward interracial understanding has come through the trade unions. Probably no movement in the past 30 years has been so successful in softening race prejudice. He didn't say our movement was perfect. He didn't say we had it all together, but he was saying our movement is helping to move our country toward more justice and more equality, and we need to keep moving in that direction. I want to talk just a little bit about right to work. I'm going to get to the next slide, we'll explain it, but let me explain where it comes from. It's union busting combined with racism. This is Vance Muse, who is an evil, ugly, strategic bigot. I quote, "From now on, white women and white men will be forced into organizations with black African apes with whom they will have to call brothers or lose their jobs. There's no way to put this other than extreme racism and extreme bigotry, but it's being done with a strategic purpose, and that's to try and get white workers to hate black workers and other workers of color, so that we can't unite and build a strong union, and hoping that they will fall into the same stupid mistakes that they have been making in previous decades that Philip Armour, 28 years, was talking about." Am I making sense here, brothers and sisters? Yeah. I can't hear you. Yeah, this is the use of racism to drive us up is strategic. And if we fall into that trap, we lose. And so what happens in 1947, our movement's at the peak of its power. They passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which says we can have right-to-work laws. We don't have one in this state, but the Supreme Court's getting ready to rule in a case, probably next month, that will create right-to-work in every public sector employer in the country. Right-to-work laws say that you get equal pay and equal work, even if you don't join the union or pay union dues or pay fees. So you can be a free rider and get the exact same benefits. Not only do you get the same benefits, but if you get in trouble with the employer, you can go to the union and say, you need to represent me and file a grievance. Well, you're not a member, you're not paying any money. Yeah, but I insist that you do it anyway. If the union doesn't do it, they can sue the union for failure to represent. This is a strategic weapon that corporate America has developed to try and smash our movement. Bang. We're in the 1960s, we're in a time machine. The civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, the movement of Chicanos and Latinos and farm workers, other movements, are growing in the country saying, we want to be part of the dream. Okay? Our movement is still pretty strong, but we're slowly starting to weaken. How many of you have heard of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech? Raise your hands. Virtually everybody knows the I Have a Dream speech, or at least knows of it. This was August 28, 1963. And our national AFL-CIO refused to endorse the march. I think this was a tragic mistake. Again, I say we need to look at our mistakes. What I believe is a mistake, and say, let's not do that again. Our movement was allowing splits to begin developing within us, which makes it possible for a corporate counterattack. But during the same period, when our movement unites with allies in the communities, we win all of these enormously important rights. The right to a safe workplace, the Occupational Safety and Health Act. It took 194 years of American history for you to get the right to a safe workplace. Okay, 194 years, that's 8 generations. We get health insurance and pensions, which labor led, civil rights and voting rights, Medicare and Medicaid. And if I can stop for just a second, my grandfather dies in 1932. You know, my family argues they basically killed him because they denied him health care. Years later, they passed Medicare. My parents are poor, too. My generation is the first one that did well. We moved my parents out from Chicago, bought them a house out here. I took them to University Hospital 20 times in the 20 years before they died. They never got turned away because they pulled out their red, white, and blue Medicare card. That's what it's like when we win big, okay? And we won so much more, including opening up higher education to working class and poor kids, regardless of the color of their skin. These were all huge victories that could not have happened if labor had tried to do it by ourselves. We needed allies, just as we did in the 1930s. I want to show you what it was like and what happens to working people and their incomes when unions are strong, and then what happens when unions are weak. Okay? So bear with me. Between 1947 and 1979, the poorest 20% of American families saw their incomes go up 116% after inflation. So the purchasing power of their income more than doubled. Does that make sense to you? You're twice as well off in 1979 as you are in 1947, okay? The lower middle class doubles, the middle class basically doubles, the upper middle class basically doubles, the richest 20% doubles, and the richest 5% only goes up 86%. A rising tide is lifting all boats during this period when labor is strong. Am I making sense to you here? Yeah. Got to say yes. Yes. Okay. So let's look at what happens the next 37 years as labor gets weak. Anybody notice a difference? Instead of going up 116% for the poorest 20%, they went down 2%. So forget a rising tide lifts all boats. All the increase in wealth and income is basically going to the top 20% and the top 5%. And to drive this home even more, this is the richest 100th of the richest 1%. Their income went up 315%, while here's the working people down here, barely gaining at all. These folks here are 13,000 families. Their average income is $37 million a year. That was income, $37 million. Okay, they're living large by my standards. And if they're making 5% return on their investments, their average worth is $700 million. So let me ask you this question. Would you rather have an economy that produces a rising standard of living for everybody, or would you rather have this based on your real life experience? All in favor of this, say aye. Aye. I couldn't hear you. Aye. Okay, everybody seems to be awake. And how many are in favor of this? No. Okay, I've done this exercise 240 times in 18 states for affiliates of 27 international unions. I've never had one person in the audience vote for this. I've had everybody vote for this. So the good news is everybody I ever talked to wants this. The bad news is corporate America is going to keep cramming this down our throats until we create a new future that looks like this. Am I making sense to you? Yes. Yeah, they are stealing the future from us and a lot of the people that we love and care about as they walk off with all the money, despite the fact we're working long hours and working hard. So how'd they do this? August 23rd, 1971, a guy named Lewis Powell writes a secret memo to a friend of his at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And he says, we got to stop organized labor. We got to beat back all these movements that are demanding more fairness and justice. We need a long-term strategy that'll go on for decades. We got to convince the American people that government is bad, that unions are bad, and that corporate America is the good guys in the story, which is a complete reversal of what Dr. King was saying. And he says we've got to build an idea machine to do this, Fox News, think tanks, and other tools, and we got to go on the attack. 2 months after he wrote this memo, President Nixon put him on the U.S. Supreme Court. This is the playbook that corporate America has been using for the past 46 years to produce this. Okay, so to use the game films, this is the score after the last 35 years of the game, okay? And this is the playbook that corporate America is using to win this game so decisively. At the same time, our movement was making mistakes. President Meany, who's the top leader of the labor movement in the country, says a year later, I used to worry about the size of the movement. I stopped worrying about it because it doesn't make any difference. The organized fellow is the only fellow who matters. Oh my word. Corporate America is going for the kill, and our movement is saying, we got ours, we don't need to keep growing, and we're only going to worry about the organized people. Well, 73% of workers in the country were non-union the day he said this, so he wrote off 3/4 of the population. And a fellow was a guy, so he wrote off women. This is a recipe for disaster. And so corporate America launches all-out war, not only on our movement, but on our democracy. Paul Weyrich, who is one of their grand strategists, and I directly quote from 1980, I don't want everybody to vote. Our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down. This is extremely undemocratic. Let's convince people that voting doesn't make any difference. You know, they're all a bunch of crooks and liars anyway, so why bother? Or we'll make it more difficult for them to vote. Okay? Very strategic. So you don't vote, and our enemies go vote, and then they pass laws that make it even worse for us. Brilliant, brilliant strategy. And to drive home how they're doing this state by state, the blue-colored states, they passed laws making it more difficult to vote by 2012, and by 2016, all these red-colored states, they've made it more difficult to vote. So state by state, they're making it more difficult to vote, to try and make it harder for poor people and working people and union people to vote by a variety of strategies. And it's deliberately intended to try and legally steal the elections so they can maintain their power. How many of you heard of Warren Buffett? Yeah. Okay, so he's one of those billionaire fat cats. He at least put it on the line pretty straight up. There's class warfare, all right, but it's my class, the rich class, is making war and we're winning. Well, that's pretty straight up. I mean, okay, we can pretend like there's not a class war going on, but he's saying they know there is and they're running it, so we better act like it. And again, non-violently, but to understand that this explosion in wealth and income inequality and the assaults on our movement are not some accident that just randomly happened. It's strategic in nature. Am I making sense to you, sisters and brothers? Yes. I couldn't hear you. Yes. Okay, I hate being yelled at. That was a joke, come on. No laughter. So what does class warfare look like? Crush organized labor, get rid of you. Promote free trade, move the jobs overseas. Buy the elections with big money. Anybody in here can spend $100 million of your own money in the election this year if you like. If you choose not to, well, that's your business. Make it more difficult to vote. Deregulate Wall Street. How'd that work in 2008 when the economy collapsed? Right? So many people lost their homes, lost their jobs. Smash up the programs that help poor people and working people when they're in trouble. Cut the taxes on the wealthy, which they just did last December to the tune of $1 trillion. Privatize government, and last but not least, divide and conquer. If they're gonna do this to all of us, they better make sure that we're fighting amongst ourselves. And hopefully they think we won't figure out what their game is. Okay, they have been running this strategy now for over 4 decades. In fact, my entire adult life, basically, this is what I have been living under. And I'm here to say to you, they're going to keep at it until we beat them and turn this around. So what do the American people think of organized labor? This is a pop quiz. So here's 4 age groups. Which of these groups do you think are most favorable to unions? How many think it's 18 to 29-year-olds? Raise your hands. How about 5 of you. How about 30 to 49-year-olds? Okay, about twice as many. How about 50 to 64-year-olds? About the same as 30 to 49. 65 and older. Well, there was a lot of non-voters. This looks like an American election. Okay. How many think men are more favorable to unions than women? A few of you. How many think it's women? Okay, there's virtually no voting at all. You have to cancel the election. Okay, so let me give you the answer. 18 to 29-year-olds are by far the most favorable to unions of any group in the country, 75%. The older you get, the less likely people are to approve of unions. So, some of you are, how many of you are 18 to 29-year-olds in here? Okay, quite a few of you. Your group is the most, you have the highest approval rating of unions, your group. Okay? Is this surprising to anybody? I can't hear you. Okay? Some say yes, some say no. And women are much more favorable to unions than men. Okay? There's multiple national polls that show this. And when you ask low-wage workers, that is workers making less than $15 an hour, 87% of black workers making less than $15 an hour are pro-union. Almost 80% of Latinos, almost 70% of white folk. The lower the wages, the more people are waking up and going, hey, wait a minute. Because every one of you could quit the union today and go back to working on union if you want. It doesn't look like there's a stampede to get out the door. Because you understand that there's huge benefits to being part of the union. You with me on this? Yes. And I've drawn a picture here. There's a huge opportunity in the country now. Corporate America's out to get us, but the American people are still solidly pro-union. So what's their strategy? And I'm going to go through this fairly fast because I know we don't have a lot of time. This was the Republican National Convention. They want a national right to work law. Okay? They want to do it in every state, including us. They want to repeal prevailing wage. How many of you know what prevailing wage is? Raise your hands. Okay, prevailing wage is one of the ways that we make sure that we get good wages on government projects. They're trying to repeal that nationally, and if they did, it might cause you to either not have any jobs because your contractors would lose out, or there'd be pressure to lower your wages. They want to ban project labor agreements, which is a way that unions work to try and make sure we get the big projects. And they want to repeal the federal minimum wage, which is $7.25 an hour. Yeah, it's $15,000 a year if you work all year. They want to repeal it. This is their plan for how to help working people get a better deal in America. And if you don't believe me, you can look up the citations and read the documents yourself. And Mr. Trump, I'm not here to tell you who to vote for, but this is a direct quote. I can live with unions in certain locations, but I like right to work. My position on right to work is 100%. Okay, that's pretty straight ahead. I like people who get in my face, I'm from Chicago, and say this is what I think, and okay, now I know, and now what am I going to do about it? 29 states now have right to work laws. And they're going to try and get it nationally, and they want to bring it here, even though our state has repeatedly voted it down. And when I talk about prevailing wage, all of the light-colored states, none of those states have prevailing wage. So guess what? A lot of companies want to move their work down to these states where wages are lower and unions are weaker. Right now we have an incredible building boom here, like probably we've never had in the history of the state. It doesn't mean it's going to last forever, but let's hope it lasts a long time. But sometime it'll start to come down. So they want to chip away, get rid of prevailing wage, get rid of project labor agreements, do right to work, weaken our movement. I want to introduce you to Alphonse Madden. He's an over-the-road trucker in the Midwest. He's in a blizzard, it's 27 below zero. The brakes freeze on his trailer. He can't move the rig. Company has a policy that says if you abandon a rig, we'll fire you. He calls headquarters and says, it's 27 below zero, I may freeze to death, and they say, you gotta stay with the rig. And he goes, did you hear me? I may freeze to death, stay with the rig. He gets out, unhooks the rig, drives off the tractor, gets a mechanic, comes back, gets the brakes unfrozen, reattaches the trailer, drives it and drops the load off where he was supposed to. No harm, no foul, no load lost. He gets fired, even though he was feared of dying. The right to a safe workplace, interesting idea. You work in the dangerous industry, okay? So he gets a lawyer, he sues him, he gets to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, which is one layer below the U.S. Supreme Court, and the judges rule 6-1 in his favor that his firing was illegal. The only judge who said it was okay for him to be fired is Neil Gorsuch, who President Trump nominated to the Supreme Court, and he is now on the U.S. Supreme Court. This guy who says it's okay for a worker to be fired if he or she fears being killed on the job, has a reasonable fear of being killed on the job, it's okay to fire him. This guy is going to be making decisions affecting your working lives for the next 30 years. Yeah, this is real life, real time. Here we are. Now, people accuse me of depressing them, and I say, no, I'm just telling you the truth. But what do we do? Well, Frederick Douglass is one of my heroes. He was an African American. He was an escaped slave. He was an abolitionist in the 19th century. And one of his great quotes is, if there is no struggle, there can be no progress. Find out what any people will quietly submit to, and you will have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. The street language of Chicago, where I come from, says this: corporate America is going to keep kicking the crap out of us until we stand up as a united people and stop it and create a new generation of a rising standard of living and greater fairness and equality for everybody in the country. This is our opportunity and our choice. Am I making sense to you, sisters and brothers? Yes. Yeah, they're coming to get us, and I say, okay, game on. I already been through this. And I could be playing with my grandkids today, but I'm down here talking to you because I love working people, and I made an oath to myself that I would not shut up until I'm not able to do what I do. So let's look at some examples of victories. In Ohio in 2011, the legislature came in and in 4 weeks they took away the right to collective bargaining for 400,000 public employees in the state. Boom, they didn't even talk about it in the election. So labor got together, they put an initiative together, which is a petition to put on the ballot like we have here in Washington State. They crushed the union busters 62 to 38. Let's hear it for our brothers and sisters in Ohio. They got back collective bargaining rights for 400,000 workers, and they won in every one of these blue counties, big cities, medium-sized cities, small towns, and rural areas, because they went out and talked to people and said, I want to talk to you about what's happening. You need to be informed. You need to get involved. Don't tell me it doesn't make a difference. They got their right to have a union back and the right to bargain for a better contract. And the teachers' strike in Seattle in 2015, which they won, wasn't just a strike about wages and benefits, which it was, but it was also to reduce class size and to bring more help into the schools so that working class and poor kids can get a better education. Well, guess what? That's our kids. And so they weren't just thinking about themselves, they were saying, how do we make our community better? Building alliances in our communities. And the women's marches in 2017, there's a stirring going on in our country right now. The march in Seattle had 150,000 people in it. It was the largest demonstration in the history of our state. People are waking up, and they're tired of decades of all the wealth and money is going to the fat cats, and it's harder for working people to make it. In Iowa, they're trying, the right-wingers and corporate allies are trying to destroy the labor movement. They made it so difficult to have a union there that every time you bargain a new contract with a public employer, you have to have a new election to prove that the union still belongs there. Okay? If you would imagine having to do that in your own union, you have to vote on it every time, you have to have a new election. And they said in order to win the election, you have to get a majority of the people who were eligible to vote, not just the number of people who voted. So what does this mean? If the collective bargaining union has 1,000 members and 500 people say, I want the union, and nobody voted against the union would be voted out because it didn't get 501 votes, even though it won 500 to nothing. If we use that standard in our elections in the United States, nobody would ever get elected to office, basically. Am I making sense here? Yes. Yeah, it's extremely undemocratic. They held 435 elections. They won 425 of them, and they won 28,000 yes votes to 600 no votes. They got a 98% yes vote, and 88% of people turned out and voted because they went out and talked to everybody and said, you've got to get involved. Okay? Your future is on the line. Oop. In Missouri, they passed right to work. They came in and stripped away the rights that workers had in Missouri for decades. They needed 100,000 signatures to get this on the ballot to try and reclaim their union rights in Missouri. They got 300,000, and there's going to be an historic election in Missouri that hopefully they're going to win. So what I'm trying to show you is there is a fight going on in the country, and people aren't just taking it, but they're getting involved, and they're saying, I got 2 or 3 hours a month I can dedicate to the union. Not just working, but to help make my union grow and make it stronger. And the teacher strikes that are going on. In Oklahoma, the teachers there went 10 years without a raise. 10 years. And they waged an illegal strike, and they won a $6,000 raise. They said there was no money, and all of a sudden they found it. They quit giving tax breaks to the oil companies down in Oklahoma, or they cut them back a little bit. And the quote was, we elected the wrong people. Let's go to the elections in 2018 and vote these people out of office and put in pro-labor and pro-union people. And I would say to everybody, every one of you, if you're not registered to vote, make sure you're registered to vote. Make sure you vote in 2018. Make sure everybody in your family is registered to vote and everybody you know is registered to vote, and get out and vote. Because by God, these elections in November are hugely important. They tried to get rid of federal prevailing wage, which would have directly affected every one of you in this room. Okay, this was in last July. Every Democrat in the U.S. House voted against it, and 178 Republicans voted for it. And we managed to beat it. Sisters and brothers, their knives are sharp, their knives are long, and they are trying to slit our throats economically and destroy the laws that we fought for decades to get. Are we going to let them do that? No! I can't hear you. No! You are new union members. Get involved. Become good trade unionists. Make sure you're skilled at your craft so you can make your employers profits. But by God, I say, get involved. It's your future. My future's pretty much set, okay? But you're young, most of you. Okay? And make sure you don't let them take away your future. And the fight for $15 an hour, so that the idea being that if you work full-time in the United States, we shouldn't be poor. What, in a country this wealthy, how in the world can you work full-time and be poor in this country? And it started right here at SeaTac after Alaska Airlines fired 1,100 union workers who were making $20 an hour with a good pension and good fringe benefits, and replaced them with $9 an hour workers. And it took 11 years for the machinist union to get a new contract back at SeaTac. Plus, it started this prairie fire that's spreading across the country. We need to stand up as working people, united, not be divided, and turn the country around. In 1915, Philip Armour said, our strategy is to stir up racism and hatred between the nationalities and the races. Very strategic idea on his part. It worked like a hot knife through butter. Vance Muse in the 1940s said, let's use racism to try and split up the working class here so we can bust the unions back. And today, we have a man in office who says, when Mexico sends us its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs and crime. They're rapists, and I assume some are good people. I can never apologize for the truth. Well, I went and did research, and I went to a right-wing corporate-backed think tank that looked at the question of who's more likely to commit violent crimes and end up in the joint in the United States. Is it native-born Americans, or is it people who are immigrants? And the evidence was overwhelmingly clear that there's a much higher violent crime rate in the United States among people born in this country than among immigrants. That's a fact. I mean, somebody may not like that, but it's a fact. And the point is, I would argue this is another attempt to get people like me to hate some of the people in this room who don't look like me and convince me that you're my enemy, rather than you are my brother and you are my sister, and we're all part of the working people, and we need to stick together. Because if we don't, we get split up, and they run the tables like they have done with us so many times. Almost 3/4 of the people in the United States support a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, and almost 2/3 oppose this Mexican wall. These are facts on the ground. Multiple national polls show this. And one of the ways that people are standing up, and I think it's important to put a human face on this issue because this is one of the ways they are inflaming us these days. Eber Garcia Vasquez fled Guatemala in the late 1980s after almost all of his family was murdered by death squads. They were backed by the government using U.S. weapons and backed by the U.S. government. These are facts on the ground. He came to Queens in New York City, lived there for 27 years, worked as a Teamster for 26 years, never in trouble with the law, and he gets deported and leaves 4 kids, 3 grandkids, and a disabled wife, still in New York City. Maybe there are other ways to figure out how to solve this problem than this. And the Teamsters Union in New York City and in Puerto Rico said, we're a sanctuary union and we're going to stick up for our immigrant brothers and sisters, not only in the union, but in our community. Understanding, again, the old labor saying, an injury to one is an injury to all. How we fix this problem is complicated. But if we say, I am supposed to hate some of the people in this room because you don't look like me and maybe you came from a foreign country, I don't know. I say, we can't go there. Our history shows us that when we do, we lose, and people get hurt. And sisters and brothers, we have a chance to build a better future if we stand arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder with each other and say, I have more in common with you than whatever differences we may have in this room. And let us honor and respect our differences as we work together to create a better union and a better America. The march in Charlottesville, Virginia, in August of 2017, there were white supremacists, members of the Klan, and neo-Nazis marching. This looks like a torchlight parade from Nazi Germany, or a Ku Klux Klan rally, or a lynching rally. And one of their chants was, we will not be ruled by Jews. Where in the world did this come from? Straight out of Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler. And you know, this gets really personal, and this is where it's important for us to understand each other and learn more about each other. And that's why I did a little bit of asking you a little bit about who you are. My wife is half Jewish, a quarter Ethiopian, and a quarter Sicilian. So we're sitting around the dinner table with 4 generations of our family. My mother-in-law is half Ethiopian and she looks black, okay? My wife looks white, and we got the kids and the grandkids. We got 4 generations there, and we're having a conversation about these people want to come get us because we're Jewish and because we're African American. And because, what did we do? Because we chose to be human beings and live in the United States. Our history has some very ugly stuff that I showed you, and I would say, sisters and brothers, we got to stand up and say no to this kind of hate, and say, you are trying to divide us and we will not go there. This is the only quote that's mine. The ultimate test of a person, of a union, of a movement, and a person and a people is not whether or not we get knocked down. It's what do we do when we get up? Are we stronger? Are we smarter? Are we more determined? And are we more united? This is always our choice. Sisters and brothers, I hope that you're willing to stand up with me, hold hands with each other, and say, let's take our country back, honor our differences, and create a better future. Are you with me on this, sisters and brothers? Yeah. I can't hear you. Wow. Yes. You know, and I would point out that if I could just say one thing, a couple things in closing. If I was sitting out in the audience and I was one of you, which I'm clearly not, I'd look up here and go, here's some 68-year-old native-born Irish pasty boy white guy, and I wonder if he has any idea what my life is like. Okay? And it would be a legitimate thing that people would be wondering. And I would say, we can tell something about a book by its cover, but in order to know who we really are, we have to open up our hearts to each other and say, let me tell you who I am and what I stand for. And all of a sudden, it gets a lot more complicated, but we have much more of an opportunity to find common ground and stick together. I gave you 125 years of history of working people in this country and labor in 1 hour. Okay, it was a quick run through history. I left a lot of stuff out. But I hope that you get a glimpse of when we come together as a people and honor and respect each other, regardless of our differences of race, creed, color, national origin, sexual orientation, gender, religion, or lack thereof, or disability. I may have forgotten some slice of this, and if I do, forgive me. But I say to ourselves, I want to create the American salad. And what does that salad mean to me? That every fruit and vegetable in that salad is allowed to retain its color, its taste, its shape, its texture, and its smell. And that salad is drawn together by a salad dressing of love, tolerance, and respect. That's the America that I want. I want to dig into that salad, by God, and be able to enjoy it. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Become great trade unionists. Let's change America. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. Really great to hear from Mark. Obviously, you guys are a big part of this movement. Moving forward, you guys are our future, really, for the union. It's as good as and strong as what we make it, right? So get involved, get registered to vote. If you're not registered to vote today, please grab a voter registry right over here on the table. If you are registered to vote, please vote. The elections are coming up this November, so we have more, electing different legislators, senators, lots of different